Hi, thanks for joining me. My name's David, and I just finished this biography of Hans Holbein. The subtitle is Portrait of an Unknown Man, and the author is Derek Wilson. Hans Holbein is a painter, and he lived in the time of Erasmus and Henry VIII. So this is really an outstanding book. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Now, one thing you have to understand about when you read about this period of time, it's very well documented. Some of the famous people like Henry VIII and Erasmus, what they were doing, what they were writing. It's fairly well known and documented. But for a person like Hans Holbein, who is a painter, certainly we see his paintings and we see what he was producing for his profession, but there's not a lot known about his personalities. So the author, Derek Wilson, they have a difficult time because one must recognize that if the author just sticks to what's available in history, there's not much there. There's just birth dates, and then there's the children and the marriage and where he lived. The author must look at the time and describe the social issues and the people that he was involved with. The author has to make a kind of a jigsaw puzzle and put it together. But a lot of it's inference. They're just saying he painted this famous person. So obviously he knew that famous person. And we know a lot about that famous person, say Henry VIII or Erasmus or Thomas More. And so he knew about that person, and he existed in their social circle. So the author must put all this together and give us an idea of the world that Hans Holbein lived in without knowing a lot of specifics about Hans Holbein. And in this volume, Derek Wilson does an outstanding job. He does what you can do. He does, you don't want to make things up, but you have to infer a lot of things in order to determine who Hans Holbein was. The subject's Hans Holbein. Henry VIII is, historically more famous. Erasmus is famous in literature and history, but, Hans Holbein is really only famous in art history. From a historical point of view, Hans Holbein is not that, it's just a footnote. He's just the guy who made the paintings, but from an art history point of view, he's a superstar. He is a superstar. If you look at these historical events that Hans Holbein lived through, it's just amazing that he was able to survive, Okay, let's start more toward the beginning though, and do a little kind of a short chronology of what I learned. Hans Holbein's father was a painter, and we have some paintings by him. Now then, and Hans Holbein also had an older brother who was a painter. There are some known paintings by his brother, but they were from Augsburg, and then they moved to Basel, and they were successful in that area. Then his father and his brother seemed to have some kind of financial issues. And so his father stopped getting commissions in art, and then his brother disappeared from history. There were a lot of religious factions at this time, and some people were staunchly for the Roman Catholic Church, and others were criticizing the church. There was a lot of verbal conflicts and often violent conflicts around the subject of the church. It's kind of difficult to understand in our time how much controversy and division there was at the time, but it was fierce. And Hans Holbein, he had his own beliefs, I'm sure, but, he's just a painter. He just wants to paint. He just wants to make beautiful portraits. And that's what he wants to do. But at the same time, he does seem to be ambitious because he wanted to paint these famous people. Why didn't he just paint regular people? He didn't do that. He wanted to paint the most famous celebrities of his time. And so he painted Erasmus, and he was Erasmus's painter. And then later, Erasmus recommended him to Thomas More in England. So Hans Holbein went to England. He left his wife and went to England and painted Thomas More. And then he became very closely associated with Thomas More, who was a very important part of the early reign of Henry VIII. We know that Henry VIII had a tumultuous reign. I kind of avoided reading about Henry VIII because he's just kind of a distasteful person to me. But reading this book, I am a little more interested in Henry VIII. So then the book turns into all the machinations of the Henry VIII monarchy, which have been documented in many other books. And I'll probably at some point spend some time on reading more about Henry VIII. As I said, this is about Hans Holbein. Now then, to quickly move through the reign of Henry VIII, Thomas More disagreed with Henry VIII, and he was expelled from the royal influence. Then after a few years, Hans Holbein became friends with the Boleyn family, while they were favored by Henry VIII. And as we know, they were expelled from the Henry VIII inner circle. Then Hans Holbein was painting Henry VIII. We have this volatile king who has absolute power, and how Hans Holbein was able to have friendships with some of these people in the royal entourage that were later expelled, and Hans Holbein was able to maneuver through these relationships and still be favored by the king, because Henry VIII hired Hans Holbein to paint him. And we have many portraits of Henry VIII by Hans Holbein. And I would say that a substantial part of the fame of Henry VIII is the portraits of Henry VIII made by Hans Holbein. You take away all those portraits, Henry VIII loses a little stature. It's because we know what he looks like, and the outstanding, excellent, and perfect portraits of Hans Holbein. I think that the reputation of Henry VIII would be diminished. Because when you read about Henry VIII, I just see a horrible person. When I look at the paintings, I kind of see a stern, forceful, powerful man. I think he's humanized by the Hans Holbein portraits. But we can only guess about how Hans Holbein was able to be a foreigner in Henry VIII's court and to maintain his stature and actually improve his station in Henry VIII's court to become the king's painter. The fact that he was in Henry VIII's court does imply that he had a political affinity to some of the ideas of Henry VIII, because Henry VIII has very strong opinions. If you're around a person like that, you must reflect their opinions back to them in order to survive. And he was able to survive while other people were getting their heads chopped off. So he must have had extraordinary social intelligence. And I wanted to say a little bit about my own conclusions about Hans Holbein. Certainly he was a great painter, one of my favorites. And that's when I'm considering maybe hundreds and hundreds of painters that I know of. He's one of my favorites. But I think you can make some conclusions about him. His paintings are very realistic. So let's make the broad statement that he lived in reality. He lived in, this is the way the world is, and I'm going to succeed with what is going on in reality. I'm going to make that observation about him. I think I can also make the assumption that Hans Holbein was a very precise man. If you look at his paintings and the way he depicted the clothing and the faces, and you can see whiskers on some of his faces, and the detail is just, it's unimaginable that he could include all these things. He's one of those top tier painters where I try to imagine how it's done. It's beyond my capacity to determine how he did this. And though he was so precise and it's seemingly scientific, his portraits have so much humanity. I can form a connection between the subjects and me after 500 years. Let's also say that he painted these very famous people. So in order to be in the arena of these people, you've got to be ambitious. You've got to be very cultured, and you've got to be discerning, and you've got to dress right and speak right and have all the social niceties that are involved in being around the richest people of his time. So I think it's fair to say that he was ambitious. And also I think I can say that he was avarice. The commissions that he was getting are the most financially beneficial for him. So I'm going to also make the observation that he was an avarice man. He wanted to earn the highest amount of money that he could when he painted a portrait. Now, Derek Wilson does not talk much about Hans Holbein's methods. The paints he used, if he used assistants, if he used optical devices. He doesn't bring any of those subjects into the book, but those could have broadened out the subject, and I think they're valid in an artist's biography. Derek Wilson is a very good writer. It's not a long book, but he summarizes all these things that are going on, and I really enjoyed this book. And it does. I know there's other biographies of Hans Holbein, and I may get to them at a certain point. I thank you for watching the video.